Bueno, muy bien, muy buenas tardes a todos, muchas gracias por su asistencia. Les recordamos, estamos acá iniciando con esta cátedra México-China para el 2015 y quisiera plantear dos o tres temas antes de iniciar con esta como tal, a nombre de la Facultad de Economía y de la UNAM y el CHINA-MEX. Les agradezco mucho por su interés, por su asistencia. Yo les recuerdo, estamos haciendo en el Centro de Estudios China-México, la Facultad de Economía, un esfuerzo puntual ya formalmente desde hace casi 10 años, informal desde hace 15 años, para comprender esta compleja y difícil relación que tenemos con nuestro segundo socio comercial desde hace más de 10 años, ¿no? Si bien el CHIMEX es parte de la Facultad de Economía, creo que nos tomamos muy en serio una relación o un estudio, un análisis de corto, mediano, largo plazo, en un diálogo con el sector público, el sector empresarial y otras universidades en México, en China, en América Latina. Creo que nos lo tomamos muy en serio y no solo desde una perspectiva económica, sino que también en términos políticos, multilaterales, regionales, con colegas latinoamericanos, chinos, temas culturales, del idioma y por supuesto temas vinculados al comercio y la inversión. Estamos muy contentos de invitarlos y de que participen en esta cátedra extraordinaria. Yo les recuerdo que esta cátedra extraordinaria se está realizando conjuntamente entre el CHIMEX y Agenda Asia. En un momento le daré la palabra a Simón Levi-Dabá, que es el representante de Agenda Asia. Este es el segundo año en que realizamos este esfuerzo con la intención de hacerlo en el mediano y largo plazo. Mi más profundo reconocimiento a Agenda Asia y a Simón por este esfuerzo, dado, yo destacaría, se trata de un esfuerzo realmente muy significativo de una empresa y en donde la expectativa sería de que esto se hiciera en forma mucho más significativa por otras empresas de mucho mayor tamaño y que están también realizando actividades en China, ¿no? Yo les recuerdo, la cátedra tiene como un compromiso permitir un conocimiento puntual y detallado sobre China en México. Les recuerdo también, en el 2013 vino la profesora Ann Stevenson Young, de ahí salió este documento que ustedes pueden bajar del portal del CHIMEX, y la intención de esta cátedra, las tres sesiones y las tres conferencias por parte del doctor Dieter Ernst serán publicadas en el transcurso del año también. Termino simplemente invitándolos a las múltiples actividades que viene realizando el CHIMEX. Tenemos un interesante ciclo de conferencias a las cuales los invito a participar. Toda la información está acá afuera. Tendremos en una semana, mañana en una semana, también un evento que estamos organizando conjuntamente con la revista China Hoy sobre la Asamblea Popular Nacional y la Conferencia Consultiva Política al Pueblo Chino en 2015, con el embajador Eugenio Anguiano, con el embajador Navarrete y probablemente alguien de la Embajada de China. Entonces termino esta breve introducción. Me permito darle la palabra de nuevo a Simón Levi-Dabá, representante de esta institución y empresa que ha apoyado con mucha dedicación y con mucho compromiso esta cátedra, para después darle la palabra al doctor Ernst. Por favor, Simón.
Muy buenas tardes a todas y todos ustedes. Saludar y agradecer por las palabras al doctor Enrique Russell por esta introducción. Saludar a todos los miembros del Presidium, doctor Clemente Rivera, mucho gusto saludarlo, el profesor Christoph Arriler, and of course, Professor Dr. Dieter Ernst. We are very eager to host you here in Mexico City. We are very glad that you can launched this professorship, and of course that so many young people, they are going to enjoy and experience your knowledge among one of the most important issues in international trade as China is. Thank you very much and welcome to Mexico City. Agradecer al doctor Dussel por estos 2 años de importantes esfuerzos en los que la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, en coordinación por la Facultad de Economía y particularmente con el Centro de Estudios China-México de nuestra alma mater, quien no solamente apuntala, quien no solamente genera información, sino que crea conocimiento. Esto es uno de los aspectos más importantes en uno de los temas que, si me permiten la expresión, se ha comercializado, se ha sensacionalizado y se ha abordado con poca profundidad y con poco sentido de humildad y de responsabilidad. De tal manera que el encaminar esfuerzos para que las y los jóvenes, los académicos, los empresarios, cualquier miembro de la sociedad que esté interesado en profundizar sus conocimientos en uno de los temas y en uno de los aspectos torales, no solamente en la economía de nuestro país, sino en los aspectos más fundamentales, me atrevería incluso hasta mencionar que en aspectos sociológicos y de nuestro propio devenir cotidiano, el tema de China afecta y afectará nuestras vidas, de tal manera que efectivamente, como lo menciona el doctor Dussel, Agendacia, diría más que ser una empresa, no es una empresa, es un grupo de reconocidos miembros del sector académico, de las diferentes cámaras empresariales y que de manera no lucrativa, subrayo, que de manera no lucrativa, está dedicada desde fines de 2011 a la profundización y el entendimiento de lo que significa materializar una verdadera alianza, una verdadera relación, no con un país determinado, no con un aspecto político o económico, sino una alianza con el conocimiento, una alianza que materialice elementos para generar y vincular políticas públicas de quienes están encargados del quehacer público. La profundización y restar, como mencionaba, el sensacionalismo en las tareas del sector empresarial y entender que China es mucho más que un país que se dedicaba a la comercialización de mercancías baratas, o lo que se podría denominar que fue en los últimos 25 o 30 años la gran fábrica del mundo. El objetivo fundamental es actualizar esta información, materializar líneas concretas de conocimiento que le permitan a todas y todos ustedes el poder alcanzar una serie de elementos que nos lleven a lograr más conocimiento, menos información sensacionalizada y que a partir de este segundo año se pueda ir, como le mencionaba el doctor Dussel, ir institucionalizando este tipo de ejercicios, vinculando al sector social con el sector académico. Queda claro que es relevante, día con día es relevante, que China se convierte día con día no en un aspecto de eminencia comercial o de eminencia económica que afecta exclusivamente a nuestra balanza comercial. China, a todas luces, es ya un factor que afecta la balanza geopolítica de México y su relación con Norteamérica, y que evidentemente el conocimiento que se genera a lo largo del orbe y particularmente con personalidades como el doctor Dieter Ernst, nos estará ayudando a poder profundizar en este sentido estratégico y de desvincular una relación que evidentemente a todas luces se podía observar como puramente comercial y entender que los componentes geopolíticos, los componentes de inversión y uno de los temas más importantes, que es el meollo para entender a veces o en ocasiones por qué China y por qué México, quizá hoy pasando más allá de las formas en que se han superado ciertos obstáculos de comunicación, seguimos sin tener resultados contundentes o iniciales en materia de inversión, de tal manera que uno de los temas más importantes, como lo es las cadenas de valor, y particularmente en uno de los temas pues, más importantes que atañen a nuestro país, como es el sector eléctrico, electrónico, pues definitivamente nos estarán dando y será un parteaguas en esta profundización de información y evidentemente crear más conocimiento. Agendacia, como institución sin fines lucrativos, comenzó con un objetivo fundamental que fue desarrollar una agenda estratégica para quien resultara electo como presidente de la República y tuviera una línea de acciones muy concretas y muy particulares en 4 ejes, en materia evidentemente comercial, económica, política, turística, educativa, entre otros. Y el resultado de un año de trabajo permitió lograr un documento consensado por, como les mencionaba, las principales cámaras empresariales de este país, los 3 principales partidos políticos y evidentemente, y esto no podría haberse llevado a cabo sin el liderazgo de la Universidad Nacional a través del doctor Enrique Dussel y particularmente otras instituciones académicas, tanto públicas como del sector privado. Este documento es totalmente gratuito, ustedes lo pueden consultar, ya ha estado disponible desde hace casi ya 2 años en agendacia.org. Posteriormente a eso se estableció esta cátedra y como el doctor Dussel lo mencionó, se tuvo el primer resultado con esta publicación y con estas líneas de investigación de Anne Stevenson Young, que también evidentemente generó información quizás un tanto polémica, pero precisa para poder entender este fenómeno geopolítico que China está resultando para México. En esa primera edición, pues era quizá un tanto incipiente este interés que existía o conocimiento por esta cátedra, y la verdad es que, doctor Dussel, ver el día de hoy este interés en la comunidad universitaria, pues de nuestro lado nos obliga a seguir reiterando este apoyo que desde que fue comprometido el plazo de 5 años en esta segunda edición, venimos a refrendar que en esta segunda edición Agendacia seguirá impulsando las siguientes, de entrada 3 ediciones, esperemos que esto pueda seguir creciendo en el interés del público y saludar este tipo de esfuerzos. Finalmente mencionar que en el marco de estos esfuerzos académicos han habido otro tipo de publicaciones, una de ellas de la maestra Beatriz Leisegui, publicada por el ITAM y precisamente en reflexión y análisis en torno a cómo las cadenas de valor están impactando ya el comercio mundial. Este es un libro también que pueden ustedes conseguir en el Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. Finalmente, como mencionaba, agradecer, doctor Dussel, la coordinación, evidentemente el interés y sobre todo la oportunidad de que una organización sin fines de lucro como es Agendacia pueda apoyar, porque es al revés. Para nosotros es un privilegio, para nosotros es una responsabilidad y estamos seguros que los recursos, tanto materiales como todos los elementos que conforman este acervo de conocimiento, estarán sirviendo como un legado importante para formar jóvenes que estarán dedicados al quehacer público en los temas de la actividad internacional, en el sector diplomático, en el sector académico y evidentemente en el sector empresarial. Agradecer la confianza y sobre todo agradecer al doctor Dieter Ernst por esta oportunidad y que estamos seguros que con la información y lo que el doctor estará compartiendo con el auditorio, con quienes están inscritos ya, sin duda alguna servirá como base para seguir formando uno de los objetivos que es esta cátedra, que haya más y mejores jóvenes con conocimiento y con menos sensacionalismo en el tema de lo que significa China para México. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I will switch to English because our speaker will also speak in English. Thank you very much, Simon. And I simply would like to remind you so that after a selection process and a selection committee, Professor Dieter Ernst was awarded this professorship of Mexico and China in 2015. I simply remind you, Professor Dieter Ernst, he's a senior East-West Center fellow for several years. He has a PhD in economics of the University of Bremen, and he has been working with a vast group of academic and research institutions in the last decades and years. Particularly interesting is probably the BRI at the University of California, Berkeley, that some of us know, and he has been a consultant for the OECD and working at UNCTAD in Geneva, or at UNIDO, sorry, not at UNCTAD also? Also, okay. So there are few institutions regarding industrial organization, industrial policies in which he has not been working. The mechanisms of the presentation today will be Dieter will have a presentation of around 45 to 60 minutes, and then we will have two comments of Professor Clemente Ruiz Duran. I will briefly present him, and then Professor Christoph Panreiter after that. And we will have some time for questions and discussions. So, Dieter, please, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Estimado Dr. Dussel Peters, estimado Dr. Simon Rebe, estimado Dr. Ruiz Duran, und vielen Dank, Dr. Christoph Panreiter, to make it international, right? No, but now getting serious. Es un privilegio haber sido invitado como profesor de Relaciones Mexicana-China. Es un privilegio estoy contento de estar de nuevo en la Ciudad de México. Estoy contento de haber conocido a Enrique por muchos años y soy un gran admirador de su trabajo. Okay, so far so good. Now, ahora permítanme continuar en inglés. And I wish I would have been able, to respond immediately in Spanish to. I think I got a flavor of what we were talking about. Basically, the fundamental, gap between the existing debates about Mexico-China relations and the reality on both sides. A little bit I need to disappoint you for this first lecture, because this first lecture will only mention China at the margin, because what we had planned to do was the first lecture would basically set up the stage by talking a little bit about the history and the drivers and the enablers of this strange animal which we call global production networks and global innovation networks. And some of you, I already talked to some, obviously are involved in research on this very fundamental and important innovation in the organization of global production and innovation. So that really will be the focus of my first talk, but of course in the Q&A, I would love to, address any issue related to China, but we will talk, or I will talk, much more specifically in the second and the third lecture. In the second lecture, I will use a case study on the Chinese semiconductor industry, basically to tease out, getting back to the gap between perception and reality, basically trying to tease out the transformations of industrial and innovation policy making in China. And there are many, many misconceptions, in particular in Washington, D.C., but probably also here in Mexico, Distrito Federal. There are many misconceptions, and I can hopefully just convey a few of the more important, characteristics of the Walden China's approach to industrial and innovation policy. And in the third lecture, we will really try to get head-on into what are the policy implications. So if you bear with me, that's the idea. So now getting into the first lecture. What I thought I would do is basically, talking a little bit about what are the driving forces and the characteristics of these global network arrangements. What's really behind it? What do we know? What do we not know but would need to know about these drivers and enabling factors? Secondly, do we get a sense now? Do we have research from different disciplines? And economics, unfortunately, is the last one who was actually, getting involved in these themes. Do we have a sense of the increasing diversity and complexity of these global network arrangements? And thirdly, what are possible impacts of these global network arrangements for the geographic distribution of knowledge? So this is a big agenda, and I'm not a particularly fast speaker, so I try hopefully to convey at least some initial ideas on these three topics. So what do we know about the prime movers and the defining characteristics of global production networks? Maybe we start with that. And I hope this works. Okay. No, it doesn't. Can I? So I need to go there, right? It's better. Oh, okay. I like to sit, But yeah. Yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. So in the meantime, let me just say, I think it was in the mid-90s that in Berkeley we started to try to figure out ways to conceptualize developments in the U.S. electronics industry, the globalization of the U.S. electronics industry. And we did a case study on the hard disk drive industry, and somehow, we realized there were quite important developments, and the way I then conceptualized it was there's something, moving away from a partial form of globalization where multinationals basically would invest in a loose patchwork of standalone affiliates, joint ventures, and suppliers that are scattered across the globe and that coexist without much interaction. So that, in our terminology then, was partial globalization. And that was, a form of globalization that has been around for centuries, and so there were gradual developments where companies, and in particular, these global firms, tried to improve or to reduce the barriers of partial globalization. In essence, global production networks are an important form of institutional organizational innovation that enable to overcome the... I'm very famous for doing these things, so Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So, yeah, clear. But right now I don't need it. So the global production networks, this was actually a process, of trial and error and trying to develop forms that would basically try to achieve two things. On the one hand, it would enable companies to use the powerful developments in technology that enabled fragmentation, that is, the separation of different processes in production. So in particular, it would enable them to separate labor-intensive processes. That's how it started, as you know. And to move these labor-intensive processes to low-cost labor locations. So fragmentation is one. The other one is integration, because the fragmentation, of course, also was it existed, in the partial globalization, but integration, the capacity to integrate these dispersed production, supplier, and customer knowledge bases is something that I would argue, is something that is really new, was then new, and it's essential to understand that particular element. Now, coordination, of course, brings with it huge advantages, but it comes at tremendous costs. And so, as a result of that, the tension between the advantages and the costs of coordination describes, this somewhat, it's not a straightforward development. There were many different approaches of how to develop these global production networks. Okay, one last thing on the global production networks, which I think is important, talking about governance. How are these, institutional cross-border arrangements, how are they actually governed? And so, at least initially, there was an absolute hierarchical form of organization where basically the flagships, the leading multinationals, would define network organization and strategy by controlling the essential resources, financial, knowledge, human resources, and by actually developing in-house and internalizing the capacity to coordinate these complex flows of information, goods, services, people. So the starting point is very asymmetric, highly hierarchical. Over time, this fundamental hierarchical character is still, I think, important in order for us to understand what actually these global production networks might imply for the development, in a particular location of capabilities. So hierarchy remains important. But at the same time, there are a variety of more variable governance approaches, which, you would see arrangements, let's say, between a Taiwanese company working as an original design manufacturer with first or second tier suppliers. I will come to that, but just to signal that upfront, the hierarchical form of network organization now is accompanied by a variety of very variable governance forms where you have loose linkages. And these network arrangements are established for a particular project and then they are dissolved. And so this makes research on these network arrangements interesting, complicated, but it's a growth market for us. I mean, those who work on that, because this thing is continuously changing. And that actually gets back to what Simon was saying. It's in the organization of business that we should be very, very careful, to make sure that we capture these continuous evaluation of these forms of organization, but obviously also in policy. Okay, the main driver is outsourcing. You know, using the capacity of the technology to locate a low-cost activity in a particular location and to coordinate it. Outsourcing. And yes, initially and for quite some time, the main focus was on capturing cost savings, in particular for labor. But that is the story of before yesterday. That is well established, and we understand, in a way, we understand, you know, what works there. What's now more interesting is the process of expanding this dispersion of activities to higher knowledge-intensive activities, i.e. engineering, basic forms of product development, product adaptation, and then moving into research. And that's, you know, why we keep talking about global innovation networks rather than only about global production networks. Oops. Yeah. Okay. I cannot do the numbers. Does it work? Okay, I go there. Oops. Faster. No. Is it left? No. I want 11. 11. No. Oh, okay. So maybe I do it here. Okay. Oops. So this one. This is the simple, you know, traditional structure of a global production network. The flagship in the middle. Here or there? There. Okay. The flagship in the middle, and then of course, you know, interfirm and intrafirm. And the traditional form of partial globalization was of course interfirm. The subsidiaries and the joint ventures and the effort of the multinationals to establish better coordination, faster interaction. But the really interesting part then was the interfirm relations, establishing very intense but diverse forms of relations with the suppliers, contractors, distribution channels, and then gradually moving on to relationships with partners in research and development, and then even further into relationships with patent pools and standardization consortia. So even there, you know, when we start with this, let's say, traditional, classical form of organization of the global production networks, you can already see aspects of the evolution of these network arrangements. Oops. Here. No, here. Oops. Okay. I'm sure you know this smile curve, of course. And so, not only does it nicely, it's a very useful knowledge device for discussing policy options, but it also actually is quite useful to explain what happened in terms of the expanding forms of outsourcing, basically moving to pre- and post-manufacturing knowledge-intensive support services. So the broadening of these production network arrangements, first into production of components, or even, you know, for ODM, just basically having the decision autonomy to decide which component suppliers to use, moving into, as I mentioned before, R&D and technologies, and on the post-manufacturing stage, moving into after-sales services, branding and sales. Now, the essential thing, of course, is profit margins differ substantially. They are low in assembly, and they increase the more you get into these, the more you get into these knowledge-intensive support services. That's, among other things, one of the drivers, you know, of the gradual transition from global production networks to global innovation networks. And I would like to emphasize there's a continuity. It's not a completely new animal. The same forces are at play, but of course the forces reflect the different economics and modes of organization of production on the one hand, and on the other hand of research, development, and engineering. Okay. Now, what I thought I wanted to just use the example of this completely unfamiliar device, the different generations of Apple, of iPhones. So this was the situation in 2008. And what I'm trying to get at is the different nationality and the different characteristics of the suppliers of these iPhones. And to cut the story short, all of these suppliers were either US or European or Japanese suppliers. But of course, they had the manufacturing, most of them, overwhelmingly, did the manufacturing in Asia. That was then. Oops. Okay, so this is the tearing down of the current +6, iPhone +6, and what? No. Voilà. What you see here, first the story, you see many, many more in original or main suppliers coming from Asia. So the network participants are increasingly actually Asian companies. Let's choose a few examples. So the main tier 2, the original design manufacturing company, is Foxconn. Does anyone not know Foxconn? Well, probably, but by now here in Mexico, you know that company, because Foxconn, on high. Oh, yeah. So the one at the top. So, for instance, I mean, they have in South China a incredibly large complex cluster where you have how many? 1.8 million workers all together, you know, congregating in this one particular location. So they are the ones who do the system integration of any of these devices. For instance, the latest iPhone. That's Foxconn. Now, these are the different key vendors of parts of the iPhone. This list continues. I can't put it on a slide. And it's ordered by importance in terms of contribution to the value added. Yeah? So just bear with me. I mean, if you have questions, I can tell you, you know, in the Q&A. When you see the display, obviously very important for these iPhones from Korea, LG. The core processor is designed by Apple, but the very complex fabrication technology is done by a Taiwanese company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. It used to be Samsung. Then Apple and Samsung engaged in this very nice patent war. They hated each other. And so Samsung was kicked out, and TSMC is now basically the fabricator of this core component. Okay, I probably need to hurry up. KR means Korea, this is China, this is Japan, this is Germany and Netherlands, but this is again Singapore. And the further you go down with the contribution, value-added contribution of the components, the more you have almost exclusively Asian companies. Okay? So 2008, you remember? It was all from the US, Europe, and Japan. Now it has actually diversified, the participants. The question is, where's Mexico? Yeah? No, because, maybe we keep that for the Q&A, but it was possible. So then, what distinguishes global innovation networks? I mean, the first thing is they are difficult to measure. With the established econometric measurements, until very recently, the conclusion basically was whether you go to the OECD or whether you go even to very, sophisticated innovation economists like Dave Maurer, basically after trying to use macroeconomic, econometric measurements, the assessment was we can't really get our hands on this. So maybe it's not that important, as some people claim. However, when you look, for instance, at IMF data, the IMF balance of payment data, you see that over the last 10 years there was a massive increase of international payments, especially for patent licensing and copyright. And you can also see, where it originates and where it goes to. So basically you have a very strong link between Asia and in particular the US. And of course the commercial consulting companies, whichever one you want to think about, they did surveys of MNCs, and we, with our little resources, we did interviews with MNCs, and we were told, look, I mean, this is the really important thing what is happening. The expansion of global innovation networks. Now, with our limited resources, this is what we try to do. And this is actually quite funding intensive. So we try to establish a database. I think by and large we have 150 companies in these the main locations, and in Asia, of course, the ones Korea, Taiwan, China, of course, and maybe one or two others. And we try to get a diverse sample in terms of size, ownership, business model. So not only the global brand leaders, but also specialized technology suppliers, and in particular companies which we call trans-Pacific venture capital funded startups. So these are basically overseas expatriate Chinese or Indians, and they get funding in Silicon Valley, but actually they do all the research in the Asian locations. Maybe I have to rush up. I can see from your... okay, so a diverse sample. What are we interested in? The drivers and characteristics. And in particular, we are interested in the impacts of learning, local learning, capability formation, and innovation at diverse locations in Asia. And please feel free, to ask me afterwards about methodology, whatever you feel. Oops. Okay. Now, in the interviews, and I'm trying really to simplify to get to the core message, is it's actually, when you talk about the drivers, you have a set of driving forces that are interrelated, but some are more important than others. So the most fundamental thing, because we are talking about research and development, is maybe these global innovation networks provide a way to reduce or contain the rising cost, complexity, and uncertainty of innovation. I mean, in the interviews, this comes most of the time on top. Return on investment on R&D. Somehow internationalization of R&D and engineering is expected to contribute. That is actually a complicated story, because the initial expectations of the, with regard to the cost reductions, it turns out is a little bit more complicated. We can talk in the Q&A. Okay, so I'm just running through this. There's the powerful pull of the growth market, of the growth of emerging markets, China, of course, primarily. You need to move R&D close, if not to these locations, in order to get a sense, you know, what kind of adjustments, recalibrations you need to do, customization you need to do in your existing products. Shorter product life cycles. So if you're far away, if you are in Silicon Valley and you want to do something, you know, for the Indian market, it's really better you have a team in the Indian or in the Chinese market. Then, of course, you know, these guys, the financial controllers, they are very systematic in, you know, cutting down costs in any business function. So once you start this return on investment, you get to the level of where can we find cheaper engineers that are almost or practically on the same level than our engineers back home in the Bay Area. Yeah? This, no, where is it? Here, searching demand for low-cost workers. And then I'm describing basically a process. Yeah? The ROE, the ROI, the return on investment, was at the beginning the catalyst. This was the main driver. But over time you realize you have new competitors and emerging centers of excellence, because after all, these countries, Korea, Taiwan, and then China, they established their own innovation systems. They are there. Why don't we try, you know, to benefit from that? So that comes in. And then, and this is maybe the least, the more difficult motivation to really conceptualize and in particular to explain. So multinational corporations have this great advantage. They can do arbitrage, you know, in terms of costs, and that's what they always do. But they can also do arbitrage for difference in regulatory frameworks. So differences in the patent system, intellectual property right protection, differences in tax incentives, the tax laws, basically using transfer pricing, and the broader regulations with regard to finance, environment, and health. Now, if you want to put that into an econometric model, you need, you know, I need a very sophisticated counterpart who can help me, you know, to basically make sense out of it and put it in a model. It is being done, but it's complicated, it takes time. But this, in my experience, you know, from talking over the years with many people who are doing this, this in a way describes the portfolio of systematic driving forces. I mean this some, next one. Now, enablers, you know, the modular design enables vertical specialization. So basically, what you did before in production, the slicing and dicing of the production value chain, you can also do in the value chain of innovation. So the technology is a very powerful enabler. Next comes, of course, the pervasive liberalization and privatization, which you have experienced firsthand in this country. So deregulated markets. That makes it easier to start establishing global innovation networks based on what a multinational corporation already has done with global production networks. Okay, these other ones, maybe the last one, which I think is very important and very underestimated, in the academic research agendas and even more so in the policy debates, and that is, this one. Globalization of intellectual property protection and standards. Now, TRIPS. And TRIPS is not something, this was a half-successful attempt to harmonize national standard systems, but of course following the agenda of the strong players and very little taking on board the needs of the weak players, i.e. the developing countries. TRIPS was then, now it's TRIPS Plus. In any regional trade agreement, you have, if you're Mexico, if you're any of these countries, you need to include requirements of a much more demanding TRIPS, trade-related intellectual property arrangements. Now the next one is ITA, which is Information Technology Agreement. Now Mexico is a very important exporter of electronics, but of course we know based on very, very tiny local value added. Okay, someone is smiling. Yeah, but for me it's a puzzle, why Mexico actually stays out of the ITA. Maybe someone wants to raise that in the discussion. TISA, the Trade Agreement of Service, or the TI, well, is actually the, right now, very much driven by the Obama administration, the development of a global, or at least a plurilateral agreement of services, TISA. And finally, the TTIP and the TPP, which is the important thing for Mexico, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And so why do I mention it here? I mention it under the heading of enabling the expansion and deepening of global innovation networks. From the US perspective in DC, the intense debate is about how can we actually strengthen the enabling forces for these global innovation networks by, developing and getting agreements on these trade-related agreements. It's actually a misnomer nowadays. Trade agreements have become trade and investment and regulation agreements. It's really a whole package. So I was talking about drivers and enablers, and I would like to say a few words about the increasing diversity and complexity of global innovation networks. And basically the story I want to tell, and again, think about from the Mexican perspective. The story I want to tell is these networks now involve many more actors than at the beginning. You remember this iPhone 6 Plus, where once you have these Korean and Taiwanese firms, and of course they have their own networks then, and so it filters down, and so involve multiple actors and firms that differ substantially in size, business model, market power, and nationality of ownership. Meaning, we now have a variety of networking strategies for these global innovation networks, and we have very different governance or network architectures. So it's really, really getting quite complex. And one or two examples. So I won't show the classical hierarchical ones like Intel, IBM, and so on. Maybe if someone wants to see that in the Q&A, that's fine, but right now, let's jump to, almost there, oops, no, yeah, okay. So, Huawei, the leading Taiwanese, the leading Chinese telecom equipment vendor, right, Huawei, and over the last 5 years, basically, they were able to establish a very impressive global innovation network. The story behind it, so I mean, right now they have, right now they have 27 R&D centers worldwide. You can see, you know, some of the locations. So this is Europe, this is the US, and this is Asia. And you can see, for instance, even in Europe, 800 R&D specialists across 14 R&D sites. Now, the story behind that is, at the beginning, Huawei was lucky. This is a very smart and pragmatic company, which really uses whatever it takes to get into these networks. So, they were lucky in getting a link up with British Telecom. British Telecom had its own reasons, you know, because they were in a mixed profitability situation, so they wanted to bring in a new actor. It's a long story, but just I want to say, you know, these things you cannot plan. There's an opportunity, and then you have, from the policy framework, the capacity to respond quickly, flexibly, and actually learn from mistakes, because mistakes are going to happen if you start this kind of building up a global innovation network, but even more so, you need to have the speed and flexibility in corporate management decision making. So that is one example. I mean, ZTE, the other Chinese telecom equipment vendor, I could show you a similar kind of slide. Let's move on to a public research institute. Anyone who deals with Asia, and in particular with innovation, knows ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute in Taiwan. It's, when you go there, I mean, it's huge, but somehow they are able, despite the huge size of the institution, they are fast and flexible. We can talk about, what it took for them to do that. But what's interesting here is, and I just picked, one example. They make sure that they establish very close relations to leading universities in the US, in Europe, in Japan, and to companies. And you see some of the names are, I'm sure, familiar. And not only that, but of course they also have their overseas, Taiwanese communities. And actually, Taiwanese and Chinese on this particular thing sometimes cooperate. Could give examples. But the interesting thing is, the ITRI, a public institution, works very closely with leading Taiwanese companies. In particular, let's say, Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing industry, a giant, and a company that shapes developments in the semiconductor industry. So the message is, develop linkages with leading universities, make sure you have students, you have very close long-term relationships, ditto, same for companies, and actually build up your own fluid coalitions, public, ITRI, with your own companies, and try basically to source knowledge where it exists, and to get beneficial conditions for that. The last one, the Honghai Foxconn that I mentioned before. This one. So they started out as a really very basic component supplier. Made quite a lot of money, Foxconn, that is. But then, by chance, they got contracts as original equipment manufacturers. The client defined everything, the specs, the suppliers of components. So they had to follow basically the design of the clients, the multinationals. Very quickly they became original design manufacturers, where they actually did product design, product adaptation, selection of key component suppliers, and gradually controlling the whole package. Now, this is Foxconn, I mentioned before. They're a huge presence in China, so they are they basically organize the whole production of any Apple product, and for many other of the leading brand companies. Now you see where they are. I mean, they started out from tiny Taiwan, of course China, 15 mega locations, really, really, really big. And of course, over time, they run into problems. You may or may not have heard about some of these problems. And so they moved to the European Union, to the US. And actually what you see here in the US, you see Carnegie Mellon for robots. So this original low-end component supplier, OEM, ODM, now actually diversifies, you know, in robots, in artificial intelligence, in the Internet of Things. So much of it is a little bit too fashionable and will probably fall through the cracks. But, you know, something will remain. So they are in Mexico, as you see. They are in Brazil. And they provide, on the right side, you know, these, I mean, this is already a little bit dated in a way. These are the services they provide for leading companies. And of course well, okay, this is probably going too much into details. The headline for what I'm talking about right now is the increasing complexity of and diversity of global innovation networks. It's not just Intel, IBM, it's a great variety of different companies of different nationality, different business models. Maybe one can learn from that. Maybe we can see, you know, how they established their global innovation networks. I'm getting to the end. Right now it's 5 minutes.
You have 40 minutes.
Oh, you still? Well, I've almost finished. Yeah, because maybe then we have more time. So the question then is, in the end, and please, I mean, please do understand that it's a rough ride across a very complex landscape, and so I expect that you will ask many questions. You know, this story is too positive, what have you? And I can give you my answers, but right now, you know, the distribution of innovation leads, despite this increasing mobility of knowledge through these global network arrangements, you know about this flatter world, this idea that the globalization of production and innovation will lead to a more equally distributed, a more equal distribution of capabilities, and that, I would say, is a completely misreading of what's happening. There is dispersion, and I gave you a few examples, but it's a highly concentrated dispersion. Okay, dispersion, yes, which is different from what it was 10, 15 years ago, and that's a huge opportunity for policymakers and for corporate executives. But it's still a concentrated dispersion. The power relationships in terms of knowledge, finance, remains dramatically unequal. So, but if you take this, you know, as the outside of the brackets, within the brackets something changed. Asia's role in these global innovation networks has been increasing from initially low levels, but it has been increasing. It's a fact. it came, the opportunity costs for some countries, companies are tremendous. But in the end, there's something that no one can take away from them. It's different. New large Asian players develop their own networks and unique hybrid networking strategies. I was just able to show you the examples of Huawei and Foxconn. But the list, of course, is much, much larger. Despite all of that, as I already mentioned, the established centers in the US, Europe, and Japan, very underestimated in the US, Japan, these established centers retain their dominance. Asia competes with the new global hierarchy of innovation hubs. Let's see what comes next. Yeah, okay. I mean, we can talk about that. In particular, it would be interesting, you know, to see where actually, at some stage, Mexico would fit in. So, the global centers of excellence still predominant. Oops, sorry. Oops. The advanced locations in places like Israel early on was part of these global innovation networks, Korea, Taiwan, and the last two for different reasons with question marks, Ireland simply because the economic situation right now is such that the resources needed for upgrading the existing capabilities are very limited. Russia for geopolitical reasons primarily right now, because Russia was very much part of these global innovation networks. Catching up locations, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, we can discuss. I mean, this is something I'm not very comfortable, but the essential message is it's a hierarchy of innovation hubs. And we could probably better define the strengths and weaknesses of these different hubs. Now, can I just take some water because I'm running out of speakers? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. And in the meantime, you can look at this nice. Okay, so this is Patel. Patel is the private research organization that really gets the best data, you know, from whatever source, on global R&D expenditures. That's their main metrics. But so on the left side, you see 1 million of scientists and engineers per million people. I'm sorry, I misspoke. The number of scientists and engineers per million of people. So it's on the left side. On the bottom, R&D as a percentage of gross domestic product. So the further you are on the right, the higher your R&D intensity. And then the size of the circle reflects the relative amount of annual R&D spending by the indicated country. This one, we know, and it's no surprise. And it remains by far the one furthest to the right, the biggest relative amount of annual R&D spending, and the greatest number of scientists and engineers per million of people. This is China. Okay? China, I mean, a few years ago, it was here. I probably should have brought this earlier graph. It was roughly here. And of course smaller. The cycle was smaller. It has moved. Among the developing countries, there's no other developing country who has moved that much to the right in terms of R&D intensity. It's amazing. The focus, and I will talk about these things in the second and third lecture much more, so I'll do it right now here quickly. The main thing is a massive investment push, primarily quantitative. And so, this shows in the size of the cycle and also in the number of scientists and engineers per million people. Where's Mexico? We're getting closer. This is Mexico. Can you see? No, but really, I mean, and Mexico has a history of early on, doing science and technology and all of these things, but Mexico is here. Malaysia, for me, actually, despite the difference in size of population, these two countries are facing maybe similar problems. They are stuck in the middle income trap. They want to get out of this. Roughly the same size. Oops, where's Malaysia? Here. Can you see? Malaysia. Roughly, Malaysia is a little bit further on with regard to R&D. Oh, can you see? With regard to R&D intensity. Now, just look around the neighborhood. India, yeah, is massive, but actually, we did a study for the OECD on the Indian innovation system, and it has many problems, and it will probably face great difficulties to get to this position. Okay, so this, in a way, is what we know with regard to these three indicators, which don't really cover all relevant indicators of innovation, but at least they are important. This is what we know about the existing geography of R&D. So a very hierarchical one. Okay, and 5 minutes? Yeah, of course. And of course, we all know that patents, are a completely incomplete indicator of innovation. And if anyone wants to talk about this, I can do in the Q&A, because patents primarily are a means to monetize, inventions, and also to create entry barriers, market entry barriers. But they also are an incomplete proxy of innovation capacity. Now, all leading companies with the best record on patent citations are based in the US. 9 in the information technology industry. None in China, for that matter, right now. The 7, oops, sorry. Am I still there? No. The 700 largest R&D spenders, mostly large US firms, account for 50% of the world's total R&D expenditures, and roughly a bit more than 2/3 of the world's business R&D. We need to really make sure that we know these fundamental, parameters and constraints for national innovation policy. Okay, 80% of the 700 largest R&D spenders come from only 5 countries: US, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, and France. And China is moving into this club. Who else? Small countries, maybe Taiwan, but in any case, it's a very unequal. This was about standard consortia, private standard development organizations for the information and communication technology industry. Very quickly, in the end, it's roughly 50 global corporations that shape the trajectories of important standards for the ICT industry. The names of the companies keep changing, but it's still a very limited and exclusive club. When you go down here, you can see only 5 companies from emerging countries, all from Asia, are part of the club. Samsung is very much part of the club. Huawei was very smart. They basically hired, the best in these standardization consortia to work for them. Money, working conditions. I can tell stories about that. And that's something maybe one should think about. So to shortcut, to accelerate the entry into these consortia is something, any country, in particular of the size of Mexico, needs to participate. And at the beginning, of course, it's going to be difficult. But in any case, it's very unequal and hierarchical. Oops, this one. Last thoughts? So, maybe I don't need to convince you, but the new geography of knowledge is certainly not a flatter world. Concentrated dispersion. Here, of capabilities, results still in an unequal distribution of innovation. So we still have a lot to do to improve the distribution of innovation gains and the distribution of innovation capabilities. Two questions, and I will try to talk a little bit more in the next two lectures about this. Implications for industrial and innovation policies, and what does this imply? I mean, basically, maybe, you know, based on your questions, what does this imply for me? Muchas gracias. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Tita. This presentation will be available today in the afternoon in a couple of hours at the webpage of the center. We will have now two commentators before we will have, and after that we might have some questions from you and participation again of Dieter Ernst. Very briefly, I remind you, Professor Clemente Ruiz Duran is a professor here of the Graduate School of Economics of UNAM since 1978. He's a good friend. We've been working on these issues of global commodity chains and a lot of empirical work with Michael Piore and Gary Gerefi, among many others. I think he doesn't need any additional presentations. Thank you very much, Lisa. And I present you also Professor Christoph Pannreiter. He's a professor at the University of Hamburg, and he's a visiting professor here at the University of UNAM at the School of Economics, and he has been working in the last decades in detail on economic geography. It's a real pleasure and honor to have him here. He's teaching several courses on these issues, also in working groups with Saskia Sassen, among others. No? So again, we have a good group of commentators. Again, after 15 minutes, I will let you know. Please don't speak too long. No?
Sí, ¿en inglés o en español?
Pues mejor en inglés, así lo entiendo,
pero... They told me to speak in English. I don't feel comfortable speaking in English here in Mexico, well, but that's okay. Well, I really appreciate the invitation that, to comment on Professor Dieter Ernst. I guess it's a privilege really to have him here. Thank you for coming. And what I'll do is try to put some points, not really more than comment, because I didn't get the presentation on time. Well, I didn't see it before, but I guess what he told us today, there are some things that I would like to build up for my comment. The main idea will be that systems pressures to international innovation. That is the main idea. What happens, no? First of all, we have a global thinker, that is Dieter Ernst. He's really, what he has gone on is going, right now he's in Hawaii, but he has been in Copenhagen as a director. He has been in France also, and now and in California. One thing I would like to point out, no, is that he has a research agenda that he's through his life. You know, if you see what he has been going on, is technological capabilities and export success in Asia, international production networks in Asia, technology and global competition, a new geography of knowledge. So what we have here is a global thinker that is really something that we don't find very usually. He has been able to move, you know, from the idea of global value chains, you know, to this idea of knowledge value chains. You know? That's an important idea, you know, that I would like to comment on. You know? Here is some of his research that he has done about that, and what I would love is try to build over the structural change in innovative activities that Malerba and Montovio does. What was this breakdown that Malerba and Montovio does is do something that was not done before. That is, the main conclusion is the structural change observed in the statistics is guided by the specific coevolution of the variables that compose the specific sectoral systems. What we have here is that innovation is in sectoral systems, no? And that's very important because what we have is that innovation is not something flat, no? As Dieter Ernst says, but it's sectoral oriented, no? Innovation is not on a generalized level, but is based on sectors that are innovating. And here, well, if you go and see what is the countries that are innovating, they are not innovating in everything, They have specialized in innovation, And what we have here is in electronics and telecom, what you can see, is Japan, pharmaceutical and biotech, then United States. Chemicals is Japan and United States. Machine tools and machinery is also Japan and others, And we have there machine tools and machinery is also Germany, And so what we have is that we have these innovation networks acting by sectors, in this gives a very complex global outview of what's going on, What we have is that not all countries are focusing on the same thing, We try to see most of them in electronics, but the other area that is really innovative, that is the pharmaceutical and biotech, that is where health systems for an aging society of the 21st century is going to be important, is United States is the one that is doing the main innovation, So this was pointed out by Malerba at the beginning of the 21st century. But then what Dieter is really, trying to tell us, is the things of innovation, co-creating value with customers and tapping knowledge about users, global knowledge sourcing and collaborative networks, global challenges as a driver of innovation, and public sector challenges as a driver of innovation. So what we have here is that in this world of innovation, what we are going to have is not only private sector, but it's also public sector, and the interactions between them gives you an idea of what we are going. What Dieter Ernst really gave us as an input to this discussion is very important because using his own graphs, what we have is that he is pointing out that the internationalization of innovation brings in local economies. And that's very important, So this is not my graphs, this is Dieter Ernst's graphs, in that sense, no? What we have here, is the idea of cooperative agreements and standards, no? Subsidiaries and affiliates, no? Here is where we can focus, no? On a developing country like Mexico, no? What they are trying to do, no? Is if we can get through the subsidiaries and affiliates some source of research and development alliance, that would be very important for Mexico, and that is what we have to bring in for us. And then the other thing that he does, no, in this book, the role of knowledge supplier, no, is if you see this matrix, no, the role of knowledge supplier and the market mediation, no, market mediated and non-market mediated, active or passive, no. So here, what we have is this complex process, no, of doing the things, no, gives you an idea of where knowledge is going. And this, the process of local capability formation, no? And I guess this is what is the most interesting thing in what research is being done. What is the absorptive capacity, no, by local industries to really get into the local suppliers into the process of doing the things, no? And here comes socialization, no? Internal socialization, internalization, no? These three things, no, I guess will be the keys for innovation. And from that, no, what we get, no, is the idea that really going from the global value chains in which we try to segment the countries, no, by where in the value chain they were acting, no, is now that the knowledge is also fragmented, no, into knowledge value chains, what I will say, I will call them, no, these knowledge value chains is the capability of local producers to really get involved in this process, no, but that process is only possible if they have some absorptive capacity to develop knowledge and intensive effort, no. So from the slides before, no, what we can get is that this absorptive capacity will be determined not only by local producers, but also by the role of government, and then that is a public sector tool that has to be developed. And what I guess also he gives us in his knowledge, no, is that really we can do public policy and very intensive public policy to develop these knowledge networks, no? And it's something that is not only market, no, and it's not only large firms or what the ones that will decide, but this, as he put in the case of Taiwan, no, these institutes that are created, no, for transforming the capabilities of the country, like Taiwan, into some, well, it's China, but it's not China really. It's one space out of China, no? That they were able to do this type of things through that institute of the Taiwanese institute. So, but not many countries are doing that. The other country that was able to do that was in a very complex way of knowledge, no? Was Korea. Korea was able to put, for example, in Silicon Valley, an institute, no, to learn from the Silicon Valley and then transfer the knowledge to Korea, and then they were the only ones that have that type of institute in the United States. That is something incredible, no? So I guess this type of thing, no, is what I will encourage people to really do research and develop things, taking this graph in the terms of local capability formation. So congratulations for this really advance into the knowledge of how we are moving, no? And what is the role of public policies to do these type of things. Well, thank you, Ernst. Bye.
Now, Christoph Palmer.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this really interesting presentation, and thank you for organizing this event and for inviting me to be commentator, discussant. I will briefly address three issues which apart from the presentation, but which probably, in particular the second and the third, will take it a step forward and connect it to some things I'm interested in and also things we are doing here. The first, I really appreciate very much the emphasis on geography you made. Because as you probably might have heard here in the Faculty of Economics, there is an ongoing debate on renovating the study plans, and there is interest of recovering economic geography for economists, and I think your whole presentation from the very beginning to the end was a plea for taking seriously geography in space. For example, you started with describing global production networks generally, and of course you mentioned that there's an integration of fragmented processes, so there's a division of labor which is socially and spatially, and that is about economic geography, and I think that has to be taken very seriously. More in particular, when you were talking about the Global Innovation Network, you made a point which I think is also enormously important, that the world is spiky. So you repeat it, and I think it cannot be repeated enough. The world is not flat. And that is absolute nonsense. People who claim that globalization brought an end to geography, I mean, that's nonsense in all sense, but I think it's in economics, if we study the world economy, it's absurd. The world is spiky, and probably it's ever more spiky. I mean, the data you showed at the end, towards the end of the presentation, it's just a number of firms, a very limited number of firms, I think it was 700 firms, and a very limited number of countries which are in those engaged in those central activities. That means the activities which really produce most of the profits. So we still face a structure of the world economy which is marked by center and periphery. You were talking about hierarchy. The concept I would apply, center and periphery, but I think basically we are talking about the same. To quote you, you said it's a completely misreading to perceive the world as being more flattened, and it's a highly concentrated dispersion. And I particularly like this combination, because some of us only get the idea of dispersion if we're talking about China, for example, or Asia in more general, but it's still very highly complicated. It also implies that centers or regions or cities that used to be centers are declining. So it's not all are becoming equal, or all are increasing their participation. It's the value added is distributed in a core periphery manner, and probably the core is shifting. That's what your data also suggests. But still, there's an immense geography of unevenness to all of these processes. You also mentioned, and I think that is important in terms of analysis, some reasons for that. Knowledge is not available everywhere. You have to be close to the markets. Here the term tacit knowledge, of course, comes in. You have to be close to people who really know about certain things, etc. And also, I mean, what Clemente always stresses and underlines is also a particular geography to public policies. It's not every country doing that, a number of countries that do that for certain reasons, but it's also very uneven, the geography of political intervention, so to speak. So I think that is the first point I would like to make is geography really matters, and probably it matters more today than 50 years ago in economic processes. My second point is, and here I would like to combine with my particular research interests. Enrique mentioned that I'm doing work on global cities. Global cities is in a certain way are clusters of advanced producer services. And we are advancing, a group of researchers, we're advancing since some time to seek a combination, integration of global city studies and global production network or global commodity chain studies. Because we think that advanced producer service firms are critical to all kind of production networks. For example, and also for innovation networks. You were talking at the beginning at forms of governance of production networks, mentioning that, well, the very old idea based on Jaffe in 1994 is it's the lead firm practically dominating all governance processes. And then the picture is becoming more complicated. You were talking about a variety of arrangements, including also other kind of firms, but also still in the realm of suppliers. And here I really would like to pay more attention to producer service firms like financial institutions, like legal firms, like accountancy firms, like business consultancies, etc., etc. You were talking about patents and standard setting. I mean, much of that work is done by legal firms, for example. I mean, there's no patent and no intellectual property right, no protection of intellectual property right without globalized legal firms. So I think if we're talking about innovation networks, about shifting geographies in that, about shifting geographies in governance, we have to pay attention to that kind of producer service firms who have become key actors in global production networks, and I also would say they are key drivers of global production networks. Connected to that, I think there's a conceptual point which for me is interesting. You in one point of your presentation mentioned projects, that they are important and funny, I'm also using that kind of literature because I think governance in production networks ever more works in projects. So there's a lawyer, for example, of a global legal firm advising a company like Apple, and they do a project, and in this project the boundary between the legal firm and the client, in that case Apple, is blurry. So it's ever more difficult to say this is a firm and the firm is an entity which is really defined. Because there's blurring boundaries between the lead firm and the suppliers, as you mentioned or suggested, but I would also say it's blurring boundaries between firms and producer service firms. And that leads me to another point here, which is more a question mark than a comment. I have some difficulties with the nationality of the firms. So is it an Asian firm if the funding comes from Silicon Valley, but the knowledge production is done in Malaysia and China or whatever? Is it really Chinese, or what is it? So I think that it's ever more problematic, and of course Mexico is a prime example for that, because here things are processed which are imported. So the nationality of firm would be for me one point of discussion which I think is necessary for advancing this kind of studies. And the final point I would like to make, it's very short, but again related to the discussions here at the Faculty of Economics at the UNAM. You briefly mentioned how you got all the information and the knowledge you presented here. And you briefly mentioned that you were conducting interviews. And I think if you really want to understand, for example, global production networks, we have to broaden our perspective as regards methods. We have to conduct interviews, because that is a kind of method, of a methodology to get new knowledge, to get knowledge about things we know little about, things where there is no data. You cannot access World Bank's data banks, for example, to get knowledge about this. So I think we have to consider a mix of methods, and the interview to firms, to enterprises, is a key method to generate new knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Clemente and Christoph again. So we have now, I would say, we can put up a group of questions from your part. We will get first.
Okay.
Otherwise, there
Okay.
will not be any questions.
Good.
So
Bravo.
we first have
Okay.
some questions, then you have sufficient time to answer. So I would say we put together, I don't know, 5 questions, something like that. Briefly, please give your name, your institution, and then, okay, 1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, it is very interesting.
Can you say your name?
Lecture.
Your name, because then I can speak to
Okay.
you.
My name is Lourdes Marquina. Lourdes Marquina. I'm professor of here, UNAM, and also at the University of Mexico City. It is really very interesting. And I have a question for you. What do you think about this process that is going on about the standards are losing their role as a public good, and now the standards are becoming are registered with intellectual property rights. So how do you see this transformation, and mainly for political concerns, political challenges about this, mainly oriented through the small business? What happens with small enterprises in this context? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm Professor Felix Zurita, former professor at the university and here as a global citizen. I have studied in several countries in China. So I have noticed there is something that's going to come perhaps about the technology transfer. Because for me it seems that it's something that is very important. I have an experience as a chemical industrial engineer, and in Mexico we are under the domination of the United States. The technology transfer is not so very easy because once the government doesn't invest enough in research and development, we are one of the lowest. Even in Saudi Arabia, I believe also they are one of the lowest, but they have more petrodollars. And another thing for me is, I don't know if it's going to come in your presentation, it doesn't have too much to do with geographical knowledge, but also the raw materials. I haven't seen coltan from Nokia, or what happened. All these electronics appliances, they have to do with some about raw materials. And raw materials.
Okay.
I would like perhaps in the next presentation to see how is this related to that. That's for right now, later on we can talk with, perhaps in German, something more about that. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. About
Puedes presentar. Present your name.
okay. Juan José Dávalos López, profesor aquí en la Facultad de Economía de la UNAM. I think it's quite difficult. I'm not sure that many people in this school speaks English or any other foreign language. But let's go. Just one question, 2 questions. One is about the companies who enable to the change from production to innovation chains, from these global chains. I don't know why we didn't separate the marketing case. I mean, situations like the iPhone 6 in the second half of the last year, they sold about 80 million iPhones units. Most of them in China. I think marketing in itself is very important issue. And a second question is about you never used the term monopolic structure or something like that, but when you started to talk about incumbents, IBM, and so on, and of course giving a big role to the American USA companies, I think it is necessary to recognize that it is not just globalization, but there are also monopolic structures. Muchas gracias y felicidades a todos por el evento.
Gracias. With one question to take, you will get 5 questions.
Ja, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, and the 3.
Ja. Ah, 5.
Thank you very much for your conference, for your lecture, doctor, and all the other doctors. Thank you very much for your conference, for your lecture. My name is Arturo Andreu. I'm an attorney at law. I have a private firm of my own. I am a graduate from the Barra Nacional de Abogados, which can be translated as National Bar of Attorneys, or lawyers, if you wish. And I'm also a teacher in a private school. My interest of this cycle of conference is because as a lawyer, corporate tax and labor lawyer, I'm very concerned about the theme of human rights in the means and ways of production that I have the perception is going on in China. And I am concerned because it's a lot of money and a lot of income that is coming from there to this country and all over the world. And my perception is that it's something that it's in the risk of being temporary only because this theme of human rights. Because the ways of exploitation that I presume is my perception, and it's a discussion that's going on and on about human rights in the Academy of Law. So, in your opinion, is there a real risk that we are facing a new, a new risk, a global risk, because of deregulation as happened in 2008 and it's happened in 1929? And it could happen in 30 years that it's supposed to be the greatest moment of the Chinese economy. Are we facing that, I don't know how to call it, that ghost of the dragon that can be a very huge risk for the global economy? Can we be confident that this model of production can be adopted by all the countries that are involved in these innovation networks? And I'm honest, I am concerned as an entrepreneur, as a lawyer, that this may be a very, very huge risk. So thank you for your conference, thank you very much, and I'll see you next Wednesday. Thank you.
One more question. Okay, so you will let me know.
Okay.
And I will, yes?
Hello, my name is Gustavo. I would like to ask you about education systems in Asian countries. What do you think is the main element in the higher education system in these countries that gives them comparative advantages to produce innovation?
Yeah, sorry, I'm Lucia, I'm also a student from TAM, and my question is a bit similar. So he was asking about the education system, and I was wondering about more of the public policy system or initiatives that have actually managed to take innovation towards Asia and specifically towards China. So what are they doing right?
Okay, so a long list, and I actually probably most of the time I need to open my machine. Oh, it works? Oh, okay, you can hear me, right? Oh, okay. So I will try it basically chronologically, but I may jump, and try to combine some of the questions where they, I think, fit together. First of all, to Dr. Luis Duran. So, Franco Malerba is the pioneer, in emphasizing the importance of looking at different sectors. And so, of course, my bias is in the information and communication technology industry, and I know very little about materials. And the story of global production networks goes much, it has a much longer history, and the importance of understanding the emergence of global innovation networks and materials. My God, I mean, we need something, because most of the developed countries start from the raw materials and desperately try to find ways to upgrade, right? So that's on the specifics of materials, that's probably as far as I can push it. I would like to continue with your comments. I was very proud. Actually, can we see again the figure number 3, which Kim Lin Soo, who unfortunately deceased, who is the great. So I wait till it's up. Oh, okay. Then I shift for a moment. Hang on. So I wait for that. Yeah. Then the next one, Christoph. Focus on geography. And unfortunately, you know, if you look at World Bank maybe is the least of the worst, but IMF, OECD, well, okay, I mean, they understand a little bit more that differences between different locations are critically important. So we need, as part of the whole toolbox of analyzing for me, what's really important is analyzing the interaction or the interface between these global networking arrangements in production, innovation, finance, on the one side, and policy. Yeah? And so geography, if you leave it out, it becomes completely useless. Within economics, you know, I mean, there's a guy called Paul Krugman, who early on understood the importance, but of course, you know, comes from a particular methodological background. In the meantime, actually, trade economists like Robert Baldwin in Geneva, they have taken on board some of the issues, and so I'm optimistic that we get more of this. And of course, we need your work. Okay, so not flat, drivers, global cities. Ah, yeah, okay. So, in particular, the focus on knowledge-intensive producer services, production services, whatever you want to call it. This is absolutely critical. And right now, our main research focus is actually on the role. So, what role do actually patents and standards play in the construction and development of global innovation networks? If you pose that question, you immediately talk about questions like, you know, what is the distribution of capabilities you need in order to develop intellectual property, but also to protect it and to monetize it, and to use, like the leading players do, to use patents and copyright as an instrument of basically entry barriers, market competition. So I fully, oops, nice. So we can continue. So I fully agree, you know, with the importance of bringing into this research much more prominently the role of knowledge-intensive producer services. Absolutely. Now, in the US, there's an interesting development, and these things take time. Within the Commerce Department and the US Census, finally, they have understood that they need to redefine the boundaries between production, manufacturing, i.e., that is, and services. And there's a huge exercise right now within the very tight budgetary constraints imposed by US Congress, but still, it's a very substantial attempt to delineate, you know, the boundaries. For instance, what actually is Apple? Apple doesn't produce anything in the US. Is it what? It's a service company? It's a, so I mean, the result of these attempts right now are very complicated word monsters. Apple is a factory-less provider of, and then still many words. But this indicates, you know, the direction at least. There's an attempt to make sure that we understand that actually Apple shapes the trajectories of the development in this particular industry, despite the fact that it's not an IT manufacturing company. So the short response is very important. We need tons of such research in order to fill up or in order to, you know, get a clearer picture of what's really happening. These global networks would not evolve, neither could they be sustained without the role of these knowledge-intensive production networks. Next one, nationality, Huawei, particular. So before we get to the question of nationality, we need, in particular in China, we need to get to the question of, is it private? Is it public? And this is in China, as I will probably mention a bit more in my second lecture, it's very difficult to nail it down. Okay, now, Huawei officially is a private company. However, it's not really, you know, quoted on the stock exchange. So that issue that you probably have in mind does not arise with Huawei, but it certainly arises with Samsung, the Korean company which actually has, you know, a majority of foreign investors. So, but it has a governance structure, the typical Korean chaperone structure, which actually makes things even more complicated. So if anyone really wants to get down, so we have these hierarchies, the global network flagship, nationality. If anyone wants to get into this field, how do we actually identify nationality more precisely? And does it matter? Does it matter in terms of, you know, decisions on where to locate particular activities, implications for technology transfer? Yes, we need it. We need it. Okay. Interviews, case studies. We need both. We need case studies, of which I am almost a personification, and that's my strength and my weakness. But we need at the same time, of course, econometric studies, which basically, you know, take these case studies and try to translate. You remember I was showing the list of systemic drivers of these global innovation networks. Try to translate that in an econometric model where you really then can get the type of information that policymakers understand. And so also for a very pragmatic reason, we need that. Now I can go back to the figure 3. Do you have that? Oh, okay. So this actually, I mean, unfortunately, probably you don't know Kim Lin-soo, the late Kim Lin-soo, but he is probably one of the, you would agree probably, he is probably one of the most important figures in innovation theory that brought us to this level, you know, to this concrete level of really addressing the important issues. Now, I remember he was visiting my institute. he was always, you know, not murals, but posters, where he was, you know, writing down these things. And this is the result of a very, very, you know, detailed process. And Kim Lin-soo was not only the president of the leading innovation research institute in Korea, the KIOS and the STEPI, but he also, before he died through an accident, he was supposed to become the Ministry of Technology. Unfortunately, we missed something. So, I'm on the wrong page. Yeah, and you emphasized, you know, all these different stages, combination, internalization, socialization, and so here are maybe one or maybe two examples. Samsung, the company that we all know, from the beginning, what they did in order to develop these capabilities, they selected junior managers, and this was a tough selection, Korean style, you know, and no corruption. Really, really selection according, you know, to the presumed or perceived capabilities. They selected, and this is maybe also for the gentleman at the end, they selected junior managers who would then go for 1 year to a country they select, no obligations, you know, in terms of developing commercial, you know, results. Just basically learn the language, integrate themselves, and understand what it takes in order then to interact later on with people from this particular country, in the business, in the government. Basically learn, you know, learn not only the language, but learn to function in this different environment. So that is one example, I think, which is quite important. I mean, this thing, you know, in the middle, all these different learning capabilities, absorptive capacity, probably you know that term. The capacity to understand, actually really understand what you need, what are your weaknesses and your strengths, and where you need to go to get, you know, the bits and pieces of information that you need in order to complement your own limited capabilities. That's really important. And so, yes, this is a fundamental issue. So, now to the questions. Lucht. Are standards moving away from what they used to be, you know, in ISO, and basically, at least in the intention, they were supposed to be public goods with all these specific, you know, characteristics, you know. So they have become, at best, quasi-public goods. Why? Because, so the time and cost of developing standards in the International Standard Organization and their specialized affiliates, the time and cost involved was simply too much. Pace of technology change, rapid, increasingly rapid. ISO, a very good organization, you know, basically bringing in representatives of governments, but also engineering associations, but it took a long time. Too many actors. As a result of that, and I'm trying to give you first the positive reasons for the transition to quasi-public good character of standards. The result was an explosion of private standards consortia, basically driven by companies. Okay? And so that, the positive effect was that all of a sudden, you know, decision-making was much faster. The negative side, of course, is it's shaped by the interests of the leading companies. Okay? And so, but that actually opens a whole agenda for public policy. So, take the European Telecommunication Standard Institute, ETSI, which is, you know, a pioneer, I would say, in developing better governance structures for these private consortia. Why? Because there was pressure on ETSI from the European Commission and from the national governments, because we don't want, you know, at least we want to make sure that small and medium-sized enterprises from our different countries can have a say, can, you know, play an active role in the technical committees and what have you. So, overall, the move away from public good character is scary, very scary. But you cannot go back to what existed, because the pace of technological change and the geographic extension is such, you know, the ISO mechanism is too slow. So you need consortia, but you need to develop policy instruments to somehow, you know, make sure that you minimize the negative effects and enhance the benefits. Felix. Oh, yeah, we were talking about, right? The materials. Well, unfortunately, I'm not the right person to really give you a good answer. But the link, I mean, why is this study necessary to study the global production and innovation networks? At least for me, I want to know what are the impacts on what you call technology transfer. I call it technology diffusion, technology sharing, capability development in different locations. That's what drives me. Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. Juan Jose, enablers. Oh yeah, and the I think it was you. The neglectance of marketing, right? Okay. Juan Jose? Maybe I mispronounced. Yeah. Oh, okay. So the importance of marketing. The importance of marketing. You may have heard or not heard about a Chinese company called Xiaomi. Actually, this would be interesting to know. Xiaomi, they sell, I mean, they are now #1 seller in China of smartphones, lower cost smartphones. Xiaomi, maybe my pronunciation, Xiaomi. Now, okay, if I would pronounce it correctly, you would know, I'm sure. They are bigger than Lenovo, they are bigger than anyone, bigger than Apple, yeah? And so, why do I mention that? This company focuses on marketing and nothing else, okay? Strategic marketing. And so far in the Chinese market, I mean, they did not invest in R&D practically at all. I mean, no patent portfolio, nothing. However, they were smart in linking up with a leading US company, Qualcomm. Basically, without going into details, Qualcomm provides what's called cross-licensing arrangements, where a company like Xiaomi, still not, okay. Well, we talk afterwards. Where this company, you know, can basically be sure that it's not, it won't face litigation by, let's say, Huawei or ZTE or Ericsson. So far, so good. So why do I mention that? This is an example where marketing actually was a very powerful instrument for catching up and moving ahead and forging ahead. But now NDRC, the government agency, has decided that we don't like anymore what Qualcomm is doing. You need to change that. And so all of a sudden, Xiaomi is facing huge problems because they have no patent portfolio. So anyway, I mean, marketing, yes, is important, but I think marketing, branding, all is important, but without a real strong capacity in innovation, you are running sooner or later into constraints. Arturo, I'm not sure if you know, it is a bit far away. Did I understand you correctly? You are a lawyer on tax issues, or?
Tax, labor, and corporate law.
Okay, and then you mentioned human rights.
Yes.
So Foxconn. No. Come on, I mean, if we want to talk about real world issues, right?
Yes.
And
the investment of Chinese money here in Mexico, and
the tendency of our country that to do anything for money. That's my concern as a lawyer. I mean, I'm a tax lawyer, I'm a labor lawyer, I'm a corporate lawyer, yes, but that doesn't mean I don't have ethics, and that doesn't mean that I don't see a risk in the way that they are producing it. So we had a very huge.
Yes. No. Can I interrupt you, Arturo? Absolutely. I mean, we need research that actually, for instance, tries to document what happens if you have a company like Foxconn you know, which has this huge, well, actually more than one cluster in China and in different countries. And the working conditions, I wouldn't want to work under these conditions. So, I mean, maybe I'm not the best example. Pay gets better, but the other conditions, so we need, and there is, of course, as you know, I mean, there's the China Human Watch. They do excellent research. Oh, okay, so you know. But it's simply to state, we need to study from you, you know, students, younger researchers. We need studies on the ugly underbelly of these global production networks. They come at a human cost, very much so. Okay, Gonzalo, education system. I will talk, here, yeah. I didn't get your name. But I mean, in order to be able to do that on a company level, you can of course only do that if, like in Korea or in China, you have invested in building up an education system, and particularly the higher education system. Number one. The next step is, of course, you know, the Korean education system right now has many, many fundamental weaknesses, starting from corruption, you know. I mean, you need to publish, and so you publish, you know, you take this and this and this. Fragmentation. I mean, it's a long list. So the quality is there, in particular in China. The quality, in particular once you want to move ahead, not just catch up, is essential. There is research on that, as you probably know if you come from education systems. But, I mean, I have to be careful, but I would say that education system maybe is among the 2 or 3 main priorities to get policies right. I was not talking about this right now. And I'm done. And many thanks for the good questions. Thanks.
Look, we will not finish, but we will start. I invite you all to participate on Wednesday and on Friday. I am particularly thankful to Clemente and to Christoph for the comments. I remind you, on Wednesday we will have this presentation more on the semiconductor industry in China. On Friday, more on policy implications and some other reflections. I invite you also to go through some of the publications of CHINA-MÉXICO. There you will see topics of Huawei, what is Huawei doing in Mexico, Latin America, that we have studied in detail. I invite you to go through that. And I would particularly like to thank Sergio Garcia Tello, who did a lot of work to allow for this in the last weeks, and also to Rolando, who has participated in all these technical issues. Also, we'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you very much.